Um, this is my first time to present with ExchangeJS, and I'm glad for this opportunity. Before I get into the technical talk, a quick bio about myself. I just moved to Edmonton in June 2019 from Houston, Texas. Personally, I'm so passionate about fitness and healthy lifestyle. By education, I'm an electronics and telecommunication engineer. Recently joined the tech industry last August, actually. And currently I'm working in the capacity of full stack web developer. People interactions, I had the opportunity to live in countries like Egypt, Oman, United Arab Emirates, and of course Canada and United States. Also, during my past career, I was fortunate enough to visit 14 countries. And during that time, I actually met so many amazing people and seen wonderful places. So the topic that I will be covering today is React state management, in particular context API. But before I get into the context, for those who might not so familiar with what is state management. So basically, state management is where we track or manage the UI interface for any changes, and those changes usually are interrelated and can impact each other. So when it comes to UI, it's very important in the front end that we manage the application state and make sure it's properly impacting each other. So this is really a very brief definition of the state management. And don't hang on the text. I'm keeping that text in case someone wants me to share the slides. I'll keep that there so they can read after the presentation. Now, why we need the state management? As I mentioned, it can get complex and a lot of code repeated if we don't manage our state properly. For instance, sharing the user information across the application, the different pages, the different application components. So it's something that we do very often on the front end web apps. So before I get into context, we are all familiar with the probes and how we can communicate the state through the probes from one component to another. The figure on the right explains the probes drill approach when we would like to communicate state, let's say from sorry, I just need to turn on that laser thing. So if we would like to communicate the state from through the component tree, from maybe the component number 1 all the way to component number 6, if we just have probes, we will have to communicate that in a serial fashion. And when the application starts to get bigger and bigger, this approach really starts to get cumbersome. The figure on the left maybe a better representation for the kind of issues that we might face with just relying on the probes. For instance, if we are sharing the user state in terms of being signed into the web app, and we are managing that in the user component, and then the user is, let's say, shopping products on our website, then to manage stuff like the cards, and also what to display to the user if we are tracking the preferences. Now, sharing that state will be a kind of roller coaster throughout the different components and how they are structured. And then you can imagine when you restructure some or entire application, how this approach will get so messy. So on the other extreme of the spectrum, we have the Redux. And maybe many of you are already familiar with the Redux, but to me, Redux is like overkill when it comes to medium to small size applications. The amount of setup that goes into it, the amount of confusion that might drive due to Redux is significant, I guess. So Redux is sitting on the other end of the spectrum where things might be complex in terms of setting the Redux and using it in our application. Now, where the context come to play, it's kind of the midway or in between that maybe provides some convenience as well as simplicity. So this diagram is showing a situation where you would like to communicate the state from the app high up in the component tree all the way to the car component to display a component, a product list on a website. So to get through the probes, as I explained, you will have to go from one to the other and so on, all the way to the end of the tree where you would like to communicate the state. So on the lower branch, you can see if we are using context, we can jump all the way from the top of the tree all the way to where we would like to communicate the state without really relying on any middle components to carry forward the state through probes. So I think this is just for fun, and this is what we will little bit go in details with the context API. So as I mentioned, the context provides a way to pass the data through the components tree without really passing through different levels in that component tree. And I kind of gone through already the reasons why we would use context, basically to share global state amongst several components without much complications for using stuff like Redux. The question is the context ideal for every single scenario? Potentially the answer is no, because if you have a massive complex application that require so many states to be managed, maybe Redux would be your ideal solution. If you have a simple application that the state is really communicated from parent component directly to its child, maybe the probes is your ideal solution. So as I said, context might be setting somewhere in between these two available solutions, probes and Redux. So to get to how we can implement context in our applications, I'll go quickly through some of the building blocks that context is using, and then I'll demo through some code how that is really implemented in practice. So the first building block to utilize context in your application is the react.create context. And basically, this is where you create your context object. And you would use something like your app.js component to update the state of that context. And as we will see, the context has a provider. And in case the provider is not passing a value, then the default value during creating the context object would be what gets passed to the consumers. So the provider is basically your way to give access to those components that would like to consume the context and subscribe to it. Something worth mentioning at this point that will be talked about at the very end, which is keep in mind that every time the provider updates, or the context gets an update, all the consumers will be re-rendered. Just keep that in mind because we will talk about some performance optimization at the very end. Then the third building block is the context consumer. And this is basically where you utilize the state that have been passed from the parent or from one of the components tree nodes to a certain consumer. So this is the consumer sitting somewhere in the tree. And next, you can also consume the context through the use context, and this is for function components. Then the next building block would be the context type, and this is specifically used for the class-based components, where you can utilize the syntax this dot context in your code. So it's a statement that you will use in your class-based component, so you can utilize this dot context within your code block or within your class. Then finally, the context.display name. And what it does is giving you the ability to give a name to the context. So when you utilize the React dev tools, you have some friendly names displayed in the dev tools. Okay. I'm not so sure if there's any questions. Yeah, just take a note and I can address those towards the end. I'll move on to a couple of examples before I open my VS Code. So the first example here, where we would like to utilize the context in a functional component. And the diagram on the left is basically showing the hierarchy of the components. So we have an app, the app component, we have a toolbar component, and we have a theme button component. And basically what we would like to do here is to style the theme button based on the theme that's being defined in the context. So as you can see here, the context and the provider is setting in the app, and the consumer is basically the theme button. And we have a middle component, which is the toolbar. On the right side, you can see that this is the theme. This is the state that we would like to pass. And here, using React.create context with passing the theme.light parameter as a default value, basically instantiate the context. Then to start providing the context into the consumers in your app, you would create the provider, which is basically the theme context, which we created here. And then you pass the value. And in this case, the value is the theme.dark, which is this value here. And just by having this code, now the toolbar component and its children have access to all the context state. Then here down, you can see that in the theme button component, just by using the use context, we got access to the state within the React context. So here the style can be set based on the context state. So it's really simple, and it doesn't take much to set up and use in your app. So just to quickly recap this example, first we created the context, then we set up the provider to give the access to the children components and their children. And then in one of the children component, wherever we would like to consume the context, we just use the context. And we will also see another way of consuming the context in the class-based component. And then you can imagine doing that with the user data, with some data coming from an API call or whatever your application is processing, basically. In this example, I'll not go through the similarities on top, but I just wanted to show. I'm sorry for the very small font, but here you can, if you can see that the theme dot provider is passing the state to the toolbar through the parent state, and then it gets cascaded to the children. Very similar to the function with the syntax difference. Then really the other difference we have here inside the button component. This time, as I explained in the context type building block, you can have that defined in your component, and then you are able to use the this keyword to access the context. And then very similar, you can get access to all the parameters or the states within the context to style your button. Okay, now that's the other functionality that you can achieve with the context is updating actually the context from a nested component. So from within the consumer, you can actually update the context. And in this example here, and this is just one file. I just split it into half so you can see better. So on the left side, you can see that while creating, so basically, sorry, let me just start from think. So basically, again, this code is exactly the same as what we used before, just the app component as well as setting up the provider. But then to be able to update the context from within a nested component, during creating the context, you would need to pass a function that has impact or effect on the context. And in this case, in the theme example, you can see that we are passing an object with the theme theme dark as a default value, and also we are passing toggle theme function. And now when we set up a component to actually change the context, which is the one here on the right, and it's called theme toggler button. And here we are basically setting up the consumer, so theme context.consumer. And this time we are getting two states passed down to the button. One is the theme itself, which is the default value was set to theme.dark, which is the dark theme. And then also we are passing the toggle theme function. And you can see here that on click, we are calling that toggle theme function, which was created during creating the context, and also setting the style. Now, it seems like I'm missing one screenshot. But basically, which had the implementation of the toggle theme, which was actually flipping the theme from .dark to .light. But I think the concept is clear. Basically, when you would like to change the context from within the consumer, basically you pass a function, and through that function, you implement the change that you would like to. And sorry for missing that that piece of code. My bad. Okay. So the next topic is consuming multiple contexts. So and this is kind of a natural question. Is it one context that we can set up or more than one? And the answer is clear. It's you can have as many contexts as you want. And actually this might be something that you would like to do if you see an opportunity for segregation of concerns or separation of concerns. And in this example here, we are trying to create two contexts, one for the theme and one for the user. So nothing really different from what we just discussed. So you create the context for the theme using the create context function, and then or method, and same thing for the user. And you pass a default value. Then you wrap your component where you would like to consume those contexts by the different context providers. So here, since the layout component will consume the both theme and user contexts, it's being wrapped around these two providers, by these two providers. Then if the layout, then you can see here that the layout component itself has two children components, which is the sidebar and the content. And just the content here, you can see to consume both contexts within the profile page component. We are just wrapping that profile page component using the two contexts that we set up earlier and passing to the profile page probes, which is a direct descendant. So the point here is, can we consume multiple contexts? Yes, and the setup is straightforward. Basically, you wrap the first node in the tree where you would like to consume either directly or in one of the descendants. Now, getting into some practical considerations. The first one is, if you, while passing value through the provider to the children components or the nested nodes in the tree, you have to be mindful that if you pass an object directly through the value, every time the app component renders, the provider will render every single consumer. And the reason for that the way React re-renders components, this basically will create a reference for this object, and every time a fresh reference will be created, causing the provider to be re-rendered and every single consumer to be rendered. So in this case, to avoid such problem, you just elevate that into the app state. So you pass the app state, and then the provider will be re-rendered only when there's a change in the state of the app. So this is one practical concern to be mindful of. And then few other optimization points that you need to be mindful of. And it's related to the point that I highlighted at the very beginning, which is every time the provider re-renders, the children or the consumers will re-render as well. This can get so costly at some point if you have a large number of components, and if many of them or some of them using specific values or specific states within the context. So it might be a hefty price to re-render the entire consumer base just because one value in the context or the provider has changed. So to work around that, there are a few tracks that you can, or practices that you can adopt. One of them is to have a multiple contexts. So don't combine all your states in single context. Make sure you maybe follow the segregation or separation of concerns practices, and have one context per relevant state data, And also within that itself, you might break it down further if you understand that your consumers might be interested in specific values. And this is maybe the dominant behavior of the app. Then the other common practice that you might adopt is using the React memorization, React.memo or use memo, which basically re-render the consumer only if there's actually a change in the state that the specific to that consumer. So if the consumer is consuming one state out of 10, and you use the React.memo or use memo for that, React will be smart enough not to re-render this particular component. Then one last thing that you can use is to keep the children probes of your providers equal between renders, and we will see that in the example or the demo that I will go quickly through, where basically you have the provider setting away from the parent component where that updates the state, so you don't re-render the provider every single time the app itself is updating, and then you minimize the number of re-renders, or you optimize it to a certain extent. And this is the demo that I will be doing quickly, which is basically setting up the bottom side of this diagram. And if it happened that I will be sharing the slides, I kept reference to all the articles and materials that can help anyone who's interested to further use or learn about the context. Okay, so this is really a very simple application that renders this page. So this is basically, what is it? It's passing, there's a list of cars that we would like to manage its price through this increase and decrease buttons. And basically we are rendering here different information for the different types of cars that we are displaying for as a product list. So here, as per the diagram that we have seen, basically we are passing the information from the app all the way to the car component without going through the middle components. And I'll also take the chance to show the folder structure. So here, and this is a normal React app. And to set up your context, I have created a separate file where you can simply define your context, and it's very similar to setting up a store in Redux. Then to set up your provider, basically here I'm returning first. I'm importing the context into the provider to the my provider file, and then here I'm returning the provider with the values, and in this case the values are object that has the cars, and the cars is basically coming from the provider state, and this can be an API call or a list of several other product types. So the cars, and then also we are passing the two methods or the two functions that will act on the price by either increasing or decreasing the price. So here we are passing increment price, which is a function that just increasing the price basically, and then setting that price back in the context. And this is a good example where you can see that the nested component, which is the car, will be able to impact the context. Then very similar one, but for the decrement. And the last slide I was talking about preventing re-renders and making the children components not changing during re-renders. And this is how you do it. You basically split the provider from the app .js or the app component, and then you try to keep the children isolated from the app re-renders to avoid the unnecessary or undesired re-renders. Then after setting up the provider, and in the application itself, we wrapped the product list with the my provider component, and this is the header. This is nothing. This is just cosmetics. So this product list component will have access now to the context because of being wrapped by the provider. So in the components, we have first the product list, and the product list basically has a set of components. Can be cars, can be multiple things, and then the cars is another component, and it's kind of a consumer. So here we have my context.consumer, and for that we have to import the context. This is how we would do it one way, and the other way you can set up your context by saying you can really do this. You can just say context equal use context, and then you get rid of the component, the consumer ports. And then you don't need that. So I'm basically, it does the same exact thing. You get access to the context this way. The only thing you need to be mindful of, if you were to do that, you have to import use context along with the other imports, and it has the exactly same end result. It gives you the exact same end result. So you have two ways to consume. I like this way more. It's more clean in terms of implementation. Yeah. So, but this is just to demonstrate you have a couple of options out there. Then now the cars component is a consumer, and it passes probes to the car component singular. And basically this is the entire list of products, and then here in the car we render single car component. So every individual card in the app that you have seen will be rendered here first, and then goes up. So I'm using here the .map function. So here you can see that we didn't need to pass probes or anything to the product list. We just jumped all the way from the app to the cars where we consumed the state or whatever data we would like to pass through the chain or the tree. I know I covered a lot of things, and I was speeding up just because I was told I have 20 minutes or 25 minutes. So I hope I didn't exceed that. And yeah, if there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.